The Lake of Shadows, a scary camping story. Subscribe to Another World for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the still water of Lake Reverence. Stephen Warner sat by the crackling campfire, the flames flickering and dancing in the growing darkness. This place, this very spot by the lake, was once where his family would come every summer when he was a child. He remembered the smell of pine needles underfoot, the laughter of his father, the hum of cicadas. But that was before. Before the accident, before life became something dark and distant. It had been 5 years since his father died, the man who had taught him everything: how to fish, how to build a fire, how to face the world with confidence, was gone. His passing had been sudden, unexpected, leaving behind a void that Stephen had never quite managed to fill. And here he was now, back at the lake, trying to find something he had lost, something he couldn't quite name. The air was still, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, just the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. The fire popped, sending tiny embers into the sky, their light vanishing into the thickening night. Stephen shivered, though not from the cold. A sense of unease crept over him, something he couldn't shake off no matter how hard he tried. It was as if the lake itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. His thoughts drifted to his father, how they would sit by the fire, just like this, telling stories or simply enjoying the quiet. He could almost hear his father's voice, deep and comforting, like the low rumble of thunder in the distance. But that voice was gone, taken away with him 5 years ago, buried under 6 feet of earth. Stephen sighed, running a hand through his hair. The firelight reflected off the lake, casting an orange glow on the water's surface. It was peaceful in a way, but the peace felt hollow, like the calm before a storm. He stood, stretching his legs, and decided to take a walk along the shoreline. Maybe that would help clear his head, shake off this odd feeling of being watched. As he walked, the gravel crunched beneath his boots, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. The lake was a black mirror now, perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky. Trees loomed overhead, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms. Stephen felt a chill run down his spine, though the air was still warm. Something was off about tonight, something he couldn't put his finger on. Then, just as he was about to turn back to his campfire, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Across the lake, standing on the opposite shore, was a figure, a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his silhouette unmistakable even in the dim light. Stephen's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. It was his father. For a moment, Stephen thought he was seeing things. Maybe it was the light playing tricks on him, the shadows cast by the trees. But no, it was him. There was no mistaking the outline of that body, the way he stood with his hands in his pockets, just like he used to when he was waiting for something. "Dad?" Stephen whispered, though his voice barely carried over the water. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge him at all. He just stood there, staring across the lake. Stephen felt his legs go weak, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. His father was dead. He had been dead for 5 years. There was no way, no possible way, this could be real. But he was there, as real as the ground beneath Stephen's feet. Stephen wanted to run, to scream, but he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the spot, as if the ground itself was holding him in place. He watched in horror as the figure raised a hand and pointed, to the lake, to something in the water. Stephen followed his father's gesture, his eyes drawn to the still surface of the lake. There, bobbing gently in the water, was a small wooden box. It was old, weathered, and covered in moss, as if it had been lying at the bottom of the lake for years. His heart pounded in his chest. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew, deep down, instinctively, that he had to get that box. Slowly, as if in a trance, Stephen began to move. His feet carried him to the water's edge where the box floated just out of reach. Without thinking, he waded into the lake, the cold water soaking through his jeans and boots. The box bobbed closer, almost as if it was coming to him. When he reached it, he pulled it from the water. It was heavier than he expected, the wood swollen and creaking from years of being submerged. He stumbled back to the shore, clutching the box in his hands, and sat down, staring at it. His father was gone. The figure on the opposite shore had vanished, as if it had never been there in the first place. Stephen's hands trembled as he pried open the box. The hinges creaked, and the smell of damp wood and earth filled his nostrils. Inside, wrapped in old cloth, were photographs. Black and white pictures of his father as a young man. There were letters, too, their edges yellowed with age. And nestled at the bottom of the box was a fishing lure. His father's favorite, the one he always used when they fished together. Tears welled in Stephen's eyes as he pulled the lure from the box. The memories flooded back. Days spent on the lake. The two of them, side by side, casting their lines into the water, waiting for the fish to bite. He had forgotten how much he missed those days, how much he missed his father. But now, holding the lure in his hand, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It was as if his father was there with him, watching over him, guiding him even now. Stephen looked up at the lake, at the spot where his father had stood. The water was calm, reflecting the night sky. He didn't know how or why, but he knew one thing for sure. His father was still with him. The peace that washed over Stephen was short-lived. As he sat there, clutching his father's old fishing lure, something in the air shifted. The tranquility of the moment seemed to peel away like layers of paint from an old house, revealing something darker underneath. He could feel it. A presence. Something watching him from the shadows that clung to the trees around the lake. The fire crackled weakly behind him, but it no longer provided any comfort. The warmth it once gave off felt distant, as though it belonged to another place, another time. The box still sat on his lap, and Stephen stared at its contents, those letters, those photos, the lure that once represented simpler, happier times. But now, they felt like relics of a forgotten world, distant memories that were never meant to resurface. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the long day, the stress of returning to the place where he and his father had spent so much time, had finally taken its toll. Maybe that was all it was. But deep down, he knew better. The figure he had seen, his father, was no hallucination. Stephen had spent the past 5 years trying to come to terms with his father's death. There had been nights when he lay awake, wondering if he had done enough, if he had told his father how much he meant to him before it was too late. And now, as the shadows around him thickened and the wind picked up, he realized that maybe his father wasn't done with him yet. He stood up slowly, the box tucked under his arm. His eyes scanned the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. The figure that had been standing across the lake was gone, but the eerie sensation remained. As he turned to head back to the campfire, a low sound reached his ears. At first, it was barely perceptible, like the whisper of leaves in the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, and it was calling his name. Stephen! He froze, his heart thudding in his chest. The voice was familiar, achingly so. It was his father's voice, as clear as the day he had last heard it. But it couldn't be. His father was dead. Stephen shook his head, trying to rid himself of the thought, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Stephen!" It was coming from the lake. Slowly, almost against his will, Stephen turned and looked back at the water. The surface was still, smooth as glass, reflecting the dark sky above. But there, in the center of the lake, ripples began to form. Something was disturbing the water. He stepped closer to the edge, his feet crunching on the gravel. The ripples grew wider, more pronounced, as though something was moving just beneath the surface. And then, without warning, the water churned violently, as if something was rising from the depths. A figure emerged from the lake. At first, it was nothing more than a dark shape, a silhouette rising from the water's surface. But as it grew closer, Stephen's breath caught in his throat. It was his father, soaked, pale, his clothes clinging to his body as though he had just walked out of the lake. Water dripped from his hair, running down his face in rivulets. His eyes, those same eyes Stephen remembered so well, were fixed on him. Stephen couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of lead, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. The figure stepped closer, the water parting around him, but there was no splash, no sound. It was as though the lake itself was making way for him. "Stephen," the figure said again, his voice soft but insistent. "Come here." Stephen shook his head, taking a step back. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His father was dead, buried in a plot miles away from here. And yet, here he was, standing before him, as real as the fire crackling behind him. "Come closer," the figure said, his voice taking on a commanding tone. "There's something you need to see." Stephen's mind raced. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. But despite his fear, despite every instinct telling him to run, he found himself moving forward. His feet carried him closer to the water's edge, closer to the figure that looked so much like his father, but couldn't possibly be. "Look into the water," the figure said, pointing down at the lake's surface. Stephen hesitated, his heart racing. But something compelled him to obey. Slowly, he knelt by the water's edge and gazed down into the depths. At first, all he saw was his own reflection, distorted by the ripples on the surface. But as he looked deeper, the reflection began to change. His face faded away, replaced by a different image, an image of his father, younger, standing by the lake with a fishing rod in hand, smiling. It was a memory, a perfect snapshot of a moment they had shared years ago. But then, the image shifted. The smile faded from his father's face, replaced by something darker. His eyes turned cold, distant. And then, behind him, a shadow appeared, a figure standing in the trees, watching them. Stephen's breath hitched. He didn't remember this. This wasn't how the memory had gone. But there it was, playing out before him like a scene from a nightmare. The shadow moved closer, and as it did, Stephen realized with a jolt that it wasn't just any shadow. It was him, his younger self, standing in the trees, watching his father. But something was wrong. The figure wasn't just watching, it was waiting for something terrible. The scene in the water twisted again, and suddenly, Stephen was back in the present. The lake was dark, and the figure, his father, was no longer by the fire. He was gone, replaced by the shadow that had haunted him in his reflection. Stephen gasped and stumbled back, the weight of the wooden box in his hands grounding him. The scene had dissolved, but the terror it left behind lingered, gripping him like a vice. The shadow wasn't just a memory. It was real. It had always been real. He remembered now, the day his father had taken him fishing, the last time they had been here together. He remembered the argument, the anger in his father's voice, the way Stephen had stormed off into the woods, vowing never to come back. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the secret he had buried along with his father's body. Stephen dropped to his knees, the truth crashing down on him with the weight of 1,000 stones. He had never told anyone, not even his mother, about what had really happened that day. The accident that had taken his father's life wasn't an accident at all. It was his fault. He had been so angry, so consumed by his own frustration that he hadn't noticed the loose rocks along the trail. His father had been walking ahead, trying to make peace when the ground gave way beneath him. Stephen had stood there, frozen, watching as his father tumbled down the hillside, crashing into the rocks below. By the time Stephen reached him, it was too late. His father was gone, his body broken and lifeless at the bottom of the hill. He had buried the memory deep, convincing himself that it had been an accident, that there was nothing he could have done. But now, here in the darkness, with the lake reflecting his worst fears back at him, the truth was undeniable. He had killed his father. The figure in the lake wasn't his father. It was something else, something that had been waiting for him all these years, lurking in the shadows of his guilt. And now, it had come to claim him. Stephen dropped the box into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. He felt the weight of it lift from his shoulders, but the guilt remained, a heavy, suffocating presence that threatened to pull him under. The figure on the shore didn't move. It simply stood there, waiting. Stephen closed his eyes, the sound of the water lapping at the shore filling his ears. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't run from the truth any longer. He couldn't hide from the shadow that had followed him all these years. With a deep breath, he stepped into the lake. The water was cold, biting at his skin as he waded deeper and deeper. The figure watched him, silent and still, as he moved closer. Stephen's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. When he reached the center of the lake, he stopped, the water lapping at his chest. The box had disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the dark depths below. And as Stephen stood there, staring into the face of the figure that had once been his father, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He had come back to the lake to find closure, to confront the demons that had haunted him for so long. And now, as the water pulled him down, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found it. Kao Tiu Je, haunted by guilt, a father's final message. Chiu Mota. What if the past you buried came back to life? One man's chilling encounter by the lake will leave you questioning reality.